Katyana, it's so lovely to have you on the show, and all to myself today.
Yes.
We're talking about a topic today that I know I've experienced, especially difficult times when I was sort of growing up. I know every kid at some stage has felt this, and I'm sure a lot of parents out there are wondering how to help their kids with this. So let's talk about peer pressure. What kind of role does peer pressure play in the social and emotional development of adolescents?
A really, really big part. And again, a lot of parents are not going to like to hear this, but sometimes even a bigger part than parents and family members themselves. And that is developmentally appropriate. As we grow, our circle of or individuals that we tend to value start to grow with us, right? So at infancy, it's primarily mom and dad. That's why kids get a lot of stranger danger when they hit about 1.5, 2 years old, because they don't really acknowledge people beyond that primary circle. As they get a bit older, you'll see people like aunts or grandparents or cousins kind of become a major feature. And then when they start school, the introduction of teachers and friends becomes a really big part of their life. As they reach adolescence, their need to fit in, their need to have a community amongst their peers becomes extremely important. And as I said, at some stages, even surpasses their need for validation from their parents themselves.
Right. That's when obviously you get the I'm not listening to you, I'm not paying attention to anything you have
Yes,
to
you
say,
don't
right?
know anything. Yes, exactly.
Okay, so I guess then I'd ask, although it might seem obvious to some, is there any age group where peer pressure becomes a bigger issue or more of a critical factor towards sort of the behavior choices and thinking of children?
So definitely school aged, right? So I'd say that I've seen some kids in early primary already exhibiting the same behavior patterns you would expect in teens. So it really does vary depending on your child's personality, and also what kind of environment they're exposed to. But definitely sort of after sort of the first year of primary, so we're looking at about 6, 7 years old, and then upwards till when they finish high school. Once they kind of bypass the threshold of high school and they cross over into sort of college age or university age, you'll start to see that shift once again towards still having friends as a primary factor, but they would more likely focus on family members and things like that as they age. So it kind of reverts back as they get older.
Wow. Okay. That's good to know. But I think painful in the middle years. I didn't realize
Yes.
it started so young. Right.
Yeah.
What would you say are the driving factors towards giving into peer pressure? What needs are kids trying to sort of meet when they're making the choices that aren't necessarily good for them?
It's that need for validation, right? I mean, it's something that is ingrained within us as human beings, the need for affirmation, acknowledgement, validation, all of that. Remember that when you generally exist within your family unit, that validation is kind of very readily given most of the time. Family members are generally quite supportive and accepting, but once they cross over into school, it's like, gosh, all of a sudden there is this world that doesn't necessarily accept me for me and for who I am, right? So it's that first introduction to wanting to fit themselves into a mold that is acceptable. And so sometimes, the concept of peer pressure comes in because kids feel that they have to conform to something that is being practiced by the other students or by other kids around them in order to be accepted. So it is that need for acceptance, it's that need for to be liked. And some of them are also motivated by a fear that they won't be accepted or that they'll be isolated or ostracized by the group.
And when you think about sort of going to school, people always think of, I guess, the outsiders or the more sort of rebellious group of kids as sort of the one associated with the idea of peer pressure. But, this idea of needing external validation, I fit in here. Is there any kind of rhyme or reason to the groups that we gravitate towards? I mean, how do we discern? I mean, you're 6 or 7 years old. How do you know which group you need validation from?
So most of the time, kids will obviously gravitate towards kids who might have similar interests, right? So when they're younger, it would be the boys who like trucks will hang out together and the girls who like makeup will hang out together, or Barbie dolls will hang out together. They tend to gravitate based on interest in the initial stages. But as they grow up, there might be certain elements, like, for example, the concept of the popular kids or the jocks and the sporty kids. I have had interactions with some of my teenage clients who feel kind of afraid of getting on the wrong side of groups such as that because of the numbers, because of the popularity, because of the sort of the overall acceptance. So it's sort of wanting to fit in so that you don't stand out in a bad way.
Oh gosh,
Mm.
that sort of like takes it to a whole different level where you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to fit in so that
Mm-hmm.
you are invisible almost, so you don't become a target.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So that's a big motivating factor, especially if there are certain groups of kids who might not be very nice, who might be a little bit more aggressive. It is very, very common. So I think even if you just look at pop culture, like every single movie that's had that group of, mean kids, all the other kids in the group are not there because they believed in the same ideology necessarily, but more just wanting to blend in so they're not targeted. So that does definitely motivate it. And that's why we sometimes see kids partake in behaviors that are maybe dangerous and not necessarily positive, because they're thinking that if they do stand up for something, if they do defend other kids who get bullied or other things like that, they would become the next target. So that's where peer pressure takes on a negative connotation.
Okay. So what kind of conversations do we need to be having then to sort of forewarn or forearm our kids about peer pressure and sort of what to do, I guess, when it happens to them?
I think the sad reality is that our kids are going to experience it in some degree, right? And I'm not just saying kids. I've seen, it happens to parents too, where they feel subjected to kind of what is happening amongst the parent community, right? So peer pressure exists even in that sense, right? But I think the most important thing is to have your child understand that while it is normal to want to fit in and while it is normal to want to be accepted, you need to make sure that you don't compromise on what you want as a person, right? So if, for example, your groups of friends want you to be mean to other kids and it's not something that you want to do or that you feel comfortable doing, then that absolutely should not be something that you're doing. If your peers or if your groups of kids are wanting to do things like smoke or take drugs or do things that you don't want to do or that you know is dangerous, then you should be able to draw a line there, right? I think that that's the main thing that we have to reinforce with kids. It is not always possible to tell your kids that they need to be blind or ignore peer pressure, because what happens in schools is so complicated. So
Right.
I would say just teach them to know what is right and what is wrong and have a very strong kind of conviction towards those things. And that would be the main bit.
I suppose even just the basic conversation of this thing called peer pressure exists and you are going to meet it actually will help make, I guess, that conflict or that battle perhaps easier in some
For
ways,
them to
right?
manage. Yeah, exactly. And you're telling kids, like, sometimes, when you go to school, you are going to have friends who tell you that you need to do certain things in order for them to like you. You're going to find kids who might not want to hang out with you if you're doing things that are too different. And that is completely normal. Everybody is going through a stage where they're trying to fit in. But what's really important is to make sure that whatever that your friends are pushing you to do or that your friends want to do aren't things that are dangerous or that are unkind to other people, and kind of reinforce that with them.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the idea that they can come and tell you something's happening is helpful, right?
Yeah.
But I think we've all heard one parent, at least I know two of my friends have gone through this, say something like, that's a bad crowd, or those so and so are such bad influences on my child, and have gone on to sort of start telling their kids that, but that isn't the solution, right? So what should we be doing when we see this kind of much more negative scenario already playing out?
Well, I still feel that regardless, we as adults will be able to spot these dangerous patterns a lot quicker than our kids. And we've talked endlessly about why that is in terms of development and stuff. But I think that the biggest problem or the biggest problem in terms of approach that I've seen parents take on is the fact that they've always done it in a very, like, it's my way or the highway type of approach, where it's like, no, you cannot hang out with these kids, they're a bad influence. This, I know better than you do. And the reality is they will probably argue that you don't, because you might not know these children personally, you might might not be part of their day-to-day interactions. And so that will always win in terms of an argument. And so I think what would be really helpful is to point out the things that you find problematic, right? So for example, if the kids are, using drugs or they're all smoking, vaping is a big issue amongst younger kids nowadays, right? I've heard 10, 11, 12-year-olds are vaping now.
Wow.
And so, you might see certain things that you as a parent find concerning, right? And so instead of kind of putting your foot down and saying, no, you can't be friends with them just because I say so, it is important to be able to explain to your child what it is that you find problematic. I'm sure that these kids are fun to be with, and I'm sure you guys have a lot in common. And I have nothing against them as kids, and I have nothing against them as your friends. The only thing that I think is a problem is the fact that they're doing some stuff that's really unhealthy and that can make you sick, right? And I think that you yourself would not want someone you care about, one of your friends, getting sick or getting hospitalized or even, God forbid, something more serious happening because of what they're doing. Right. So that is the only bit that I think you need to be very mindful of. Right. And so that's the type of tone you want to take in the initial stages. If your child ignores you, then you might need to step in if they are continuing to do things that put themselves in harm's way. But generally start that way, because remember, with teenagers, you have a very small window to make an impression. And if you establish yourself as the type of parent who's either too lenient that they can get away with everything, or too strict that they won't, that you're not open to negotiation, then that is going to set the tone for much of their teenage years. So yeah.
Okay, so that important takeaway there is like, don't vilify the kid, but identify the behavior that doesn't sit right with you.
Yeah.
And then have a conversation about that. Okay,
yeah.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
But going towards what you were saying, what if, despite all of our efforts, our kids aren't listening, aren't changing, aren't stopping what they're taking part of? I mean, do we put that down to just a face and sit by, white knuckling it, or do we take further steps? And if so, what are they?
I tell parents that you need to be able to have a set of like non-negotiables, right? And this list of non-negotiables is subjective parent to parent, right? You might have religious influences, you might have cultural influences. It could just be like your personal, code of ethics, if you will, but you need to be able to have a list of things that you do not want your child participating in. And those are the things that you have to stand by. Your child will get the opportunity to question whether it's right for them as they age. But at this crucial juncture, they are, like I said, probably not the best people to be able to determine whether it's safe or whether something is risky, right? This is where hindsight is 2020 is a very common feature for them at this age, right? So if you feel that your child is participating in something that puts them in harm's way, that goes against all of this, and you've tried the very open, sort of gentle approach with them, then you probably need to be a bit more firm in terms of restating with them why it is that you don't want this happening in your household, why you do not want them doing this at this age, why it is dangerous, reaffirming those things. And then if it still gets ignored, then making access very difficult, right? Generally speaking, when it comes to parenting, we know that positive reinforcement and sort of that type of parenting is better than negative. So taking things away and blocking your child and punishing them. We know from research that that's not the best way to go, but ultimately I do believe that there is consequences has a place. And so reinforcing that if your child continues to ignore you.
Right, so are you saying sort of like, as a last resort, basically those threats of, cutting off internet, grounding, all of these things are then put into place? But how do you know how long for? Because I know people, who've grounded their kids for, in my opinion, extremely long amount of time. Is the lesson learned? Are things really changing, or are they just doing time in jail until they get out, and then will their behavior backlash on you? How do you stop that from happening?
And that's where it's important that children who are being given consequences are being given the opportunity to earn them back, right? So it's more using the jail analogy, that's why it's called rehabilitation and not incarceration, right? Because we're wanting to teach our children that this happened for a reason, right? So how I would kind of structure it is I would try with explaining to the child or expressing why it is that you're not comfortable with all the things that's happening in their friend group, right? Trying to be very reasonable, right, about how you go about it. If that continues to get ignored, have another conversation about, look, I've talked about why this is bad. I've talked about why I am concerned about what's happening, and it seems like you're continuing to ignore my advice and continuing to ignore my requests, and so unfortunately I'm going to need to step in. And so introducing rules effective immediately, that if this continues to happen, this consequence will happen. So you need to also forewarn your child that there is a consequence that you're going to introduce. It is not something that you should just suddenly out of anger, you know what, you're grounded for 10 years, right? That's probably not the approach you should take, because what that does is the child focuses on the fact that it was something that they're not going to be happy with, and that they were being punished. They're not focusing on the fact that they're not being allowed the chance to reflect on how they got there. Right. So, and express to them that, look, I've tried talking to you. You're not responding. I have to step in. So effective immediately. If I see these behaviors continue without negotiating, I will give you this consequence. Right. Say the child ignores it again. Right.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, what happens? Yeah. Okay.
Say they ignore it again. The consequence has to be swift, and the consequence has to be non-negotiable. If you are wishy-washy, or if you dilly-dally with the consequence, they will realize that your threats are nothing more than just that. So you want to be able to go, look, I gave you a warning. I am so sorry. You're not going to like this. And I don't really necessarily mind that you don't like me right now.
Right. Yeah.
You know, this is the consequence. And should you want your privileges, for example, if that was the consequence, privileges being taken away, should you want your privileges reinstated, this is what I expect. So they get the chance to earn it back. So if, say, a child realizes, oh my gosh, I never realized that this could happen, and they make an effort to earn those privileges back by displaying responsible behavior, doing all the things that you expect them to do, they do earn the privileges back in stages. And if they violate them again, because like just recently I had a parent who said that the child behaved really well, the minute that they got privileges back, they reverted back to it, right? It starts all over again, right? This is not necessarily something that will happen very quickly, but what is important is consistency. Right? Your child needs to learn about, this is the age where we start teaching them about laws and rules and regulations, right? The laws out in the real world are not going to be compromised, something that they can compromise on. So this is where consistency plays a really big part. So yeah, not fun, but I have seen parents have to repeat it over and over. And eventually the kids kind of go, you know what, the cycle is never going to break. This is the way things are. And eventually they kind of figure it out.
And I suppose, as long as they're towing the line, we don't need them to like towing the line. We just need them to do it and hope that by the time they hit a later stage in life, they'll stop.
I think parents I know a lot of parents who are afraid of their child not liking them, right? Because if they execute a rule or if they install a consequence, that the child would not like them and the child would not want to be friends with them. And I think that comes from, one, it's not a nice feeling, and two, being afraid that the child will then seek that comfort elsewhere, right? So there's a lot of that fear. But I tell parents that it is okay for your child not to like you in that moment, right? You reaffirm the fact that this is something that is for your own good. I still love you. That's not going to change. And I don't mind that you don't like me right now. Right. And so that is something parents have to get a little bit more comfortable with. Right. So, yeah, it's not a fun experience. And I've held many parents' hands through this process. But I think the biggest mistake any parent can make is to expect their child to be able to know the difference themselves and expect their child to be able to police things themselves. And that's never a good idea.